Here's a question. What do you think of when you hear the name Cyclops? Not the mythological creature, but the Marvel hero. Well, I'd say it depends on who you are. To the average Joe aware of the movies, you'd probably say he's the turtleneck-wearing, in-sync listening, cock-blocking crybaby of the X-Men that gets killed off screen. But to a comic fan, especially an X-Men fan, he's the greatest X-Men to ever live. The first X-Men, the balance between Magneto and Xavier's visions. You see, in the early 2000s, Singer's X-Men and Raimi's Spider-Man were the 1-2 punch that kicked off the superhero genre that still dominates theaters today.
Oh, yeah.
And whilst the X-Men had some good and some very bad movies, it's undeniable the mark they left on the superhero landscape in their 19 years at Fox. The first 2 X-Men movies demonstrated that more nuanced themes can be introduced into these superhero blockbusters, themes of race and segregation that has been staples of the X-Men comics since their origin in 1963. The original comic being an allegory for race itself, with Xavier and Magneto modelled after Martin Luther King and Malcolm X respectively. And as the X-Men evolved through the years, its message evolved too, to express the importance of pride and self-expression, just like other groups fight for today.
Have you tried not being a mutant?
The X-Men have always been a socially charged group, and the movies did a great job at reflecting that. What they didn't do great at was accurately representing the interplay and the layered character dynamics of the team itself. Sure, they got the surface level of the characters right, but in many ways they altered them. By 2019, the X-Men movies felt like Wolverine and Friends, and then Mystique and Friends, not an ensemble. Little was done to spotlight the most important, the best X-Men, Cyclops. Now I know what you're thinking, you don't believe me. After all, you have every right not to. The Cyclops we got in the X-Men saga of films was underwhelming. He has a total screen time of 20 minutes across the original trilogy, comparing that to the rest of the cast, and it's pretty much a joke. Even in those scenes, he's being disrespected, either out of focus or being taken out by Lady Deathstrike or Toad. Toad, for Christ's sake. All before being killed off screen. They tried to emasculate him, make Logan look like he's the only tough guy in the room, when in the comics it's anything but that. It's the whole point of their dynamic, it's 2 alphas in a room. In the comics, Logan respects Scott's leadership. They may butt heads, but he falls in line.
I want this thing off my lawn. Every now and then, Summers. I remember why you're still in charge. Rip its guts out, Logan.
In the movies, Wolverine walked all over him and they stuck him in cardigans. Cardigans! I personally think it's fair to call this character assassination, much like that hit piece Looper made on Cyclops. So that being said, with the dive into the comics and a reasonable explanation, hopefully I can convince you guys otherwise that Cyclops is not only a valued member of the X-Men, but its most important character, full stop. First off, why is Cyclops cool? What's the draw to his character? Well, after 57 years of comics, Cyclops has been through a lot. He's had all sorts of dramas with Mr. Sinister and his family, and that's not even touching on his powers. Scott has an amazing understanding for spatial geometry, better than Captain America, in fact. Being able to bounce his optic beams off surfaces to defeat enemies, or win a game of pool for that matter. With a single blast, he can hit a dozen targets. Much like Karnak's ability to sense the weakest point in any object, Cyclops' hidden superpower is his tactical know-how. The guy can look at an idea and just pick it apart. Its weaknesses, its strengths. It makes him an unparalleled tactician and combatant. It's how he was able to trick the Avengers so well. Cyclops is like a knife that just keeps getting sharper. He knows his opponent's moves so well that he can react to them before they make it. This extends to his teammates. Like Batman in Justice League Doom, Cyclops has contingencies in place, a plan and a backup plan to take out everyone he encounters. That's not even touching on his optic blast. He can wipe out swaths of forest in seconds, rip through buildings or cut through mountains with a punch that exerts from his visor. And that's an important distinction to make too, because they're not laser beams. His optic blasts are concussive, meaning his beams are more like an aggressive punch than they are a hot laser, because they're not laser beams. That being said, the force they exert is still incredibly destructive. Cyclops has to have control at all times. If he were to glance for a moment to something in his periphery, he could risk destroying a building or hurting a friend.
Said leave me alone! Oh man! What are you? You're some kind of monster?
No, I'm not. Wait!
And that's the draw to someone like Cyclops, the weight that's intrinsic to his power and his role as leader of the X-Men. That weight, that responsibility of his role is felt in the comics. It's why he's always called humorless or overly serious. He doesn't really have time for laughs when one bad decision he makes could lead to the extermination of his entire race. That seriousness is an important part of the dynamic of the X-Men. He is the anchor, the center. When he goes to work, he's not your friend, he's your manager, and like any great manager, they know how to bring the best out of you. Try think Aqualad in Young Justice.
Captain Marvel has been captured, and we must act as a team to save him.
Under your leadership? I don't think so.
This is not up for debate. You all chose me to lead. When the mission is over, if you wish to select a new leader, I will happily step down. But until that time, I am in command here.
He can't be funny like Bobby, or swashbuckling like Nightcrawler, or a brawler like Wolverine. I'm not saying Scott is a bore, because he has his moments. What I'm trying to say is that the X-Men are some of the most colourful characters in all of comics. Quite literally, common themes are the importance of self-expression, and that's demonstrated through their colourful costumes, but with that self-expression comes a series of personalities that are loud and distinct. Take Storm, for instance.
We X-Men learned something very special here, Jubilee. How to control our mutant powers.
It takes someone as laser-focused as Cyclops to make these people fall in line. As much as Wolverine may butt heads with Cyclops, he wears the uniform out of respect for Xavier's vision and Cyclops' leadership. In the comics, Scott towers over the stocky 5'3" Logan, hence why Logan calls Scott slim, as a way to make fun of Scott's height and build. In the movies, this dynamic just isn't the case. Scott is walked over and seen as a foil to the 6'2" Logan, played by Australia's own Hugh Jackman. Or in Australia, as we call him, Huge Jacked Man. Am I right or am I right? Anyways, in the movies, Scott is in the way of Logan and Jean. At least that's how the movie positions you to see it this way. For you to want to see Logan steal Jean from Scott. It's kind of messed up. To stay on point, Cyclops is a character that is anything but boring. A deep dive into his past and his connections to Sinister or his father, and you have enough content to be the backbone of multi-feature films, or at least a 3-season character arc. Sure, he's pretty square, but that's okay. He has to be. He's the leader of the X-Men and the face of all mutants. He's super interesting in that he makes a lot of tough calls. Some a little silly, like abandoning Madeline Pryor to join X-Factor, but others completely necessary, like assembling X-Force. To keep it short, they're essentially like a mutant strike force. Regardless, Scott time and time again is willing to balance his humanity with getting the job done. He's a good soldier, a great soldier. He doesn't stop until the mission is over, and the mission is never over. Scott is the balance between Magneto and Xavier's visions. He may have the values of Charles, but he's on the front lines like Magneto. He's seen it all just like Eric has. As we all know, Scott was the first X-Men, a true believer, as Stan would say. He's the golden boy, the example all mutants should aspire to.
I'd like you both to meet a student of mine, Scott Summers.
He's a tough character to adapt. Written poorly and he could look like a stiff suck-up, but written well and he can be an inspiration. Scott is a pragmatist, more concerned about the message he sends than the morality of his actions. He has his edges. He's a man that is okay with torture or doing something off the books. Scott is an interesting leader in that way. Being that leader is just so damn hard to explain. Think of it like this. In the comics, Cyclops has Captain America level status. He's an archetypal hero. Scott can make people rally behind him like few others can, and that's because he's usually always right. He has to be. And this is an important distinction to make. Captain America may choose the moral choice, what's right ethically, but Scott will always choose what's right for mutant kind. What we have is two similar characters, both leaders, that lead with differing principles. As I said before, if Scott makes a move that is not thought out, if it goes sour, it could lead to the death of his friends, or the mutant race in general. This is why Scott is so calculated. This is why he has plans on plans. This is why he knows his enemies and his friends inside out. That's why he feels compelled to execute those plans with such surgical precision. Scott may not be as pure and as optimistic as Captain America. He may be quite harsh sometimes. His actions questionable. But that all comes under being a leader and the weight intrinsic to that role. How it weighs on him. And that role really does weigh on him. Everyone looks to Scott. Sure, Charles may have a dream, but it's Scott who has the plan. In that way, you could call Scott an exemplar. An exemplar being someone who embodies certain admirable traits, someone who can serve as a point of reference, an inspiration. One of my favourite X-Men moments is when Magneto realises this. Scott is more than just a puppet following Xavier's vision, he's grown beyond that and is his own man, defining his own morality and being the centre of these two opposing forces. Sure, it's nice to see others lead the X-Men, like Storm or Logan. Sure, it's nice to do some interesting things with the character from time to time. But what will always remain a constant is that Cyclops is the leader of the X-Men. It's why I find it so infuriating that we've yet to see a single X-Men film with a Cyclops from the comics. The leading man Cyclops, not a kid, not a wuss, but a capable, adaptive, and focused leader of Marvel's merry band of mutants.